Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. Concludiamo oggi il secondo ciclo di webinar dedicati alla letteratura inglese, con un argomento direi di grande attualità. Con noi il professore Arturo Cattaneo. Buongiorno professore, buongiorno.
A tutti.
Ecco, prima di lasciare la parola fornisco brevemente una serie di informazioni utili. Allora, il webinar avrà una durata di un'ora. Alla fine della presentazione avremo spazio per rispondere alle vostre domande che potete inserire durante la presentazione, quindi alla pagina tuadomanda.it, indicando il codice dell'evento che è 6130. Nei prossimi giorni sarà disponibile il vostro attestato di partecipazione che potete scaricare dal nostro sito alla pagina attestati. Per chi invece non potesse seguire la diretta ma volesse comunque accedere allo streaming in differita, ricordo che anche in questo caso l'attestato sarà disponibile, ma solo a chi avrà effettuato l'accesso dalla mail di conferma di iscrizione e entro le 23:59 di oggi. Ecco, sarà anche possibile rivedere l'evento di oggi, anche i precedenti webinar, i precedenti incontri che abbiamo fatto con il professor Cattaneo sul nostro canale YouTube. E infine potete anche scaricare le slide, il materiale di questi incontri, sempre dal nostro sito. Bene, è con grande piacere che lascio la parola al professor Cattaneo e ci rivediamo dopo per le vostre domande. A dopo.
Grazie Cristel, ben ritrovati. Se ci fossimo già visti in precedenza, benvenuti. Premetto subito che l'argomento di questo webinar, di questo terzo webinar, è stato scelto molti mesi fa, quando non era prevedibile quello che sarebbe successo, quello a cui stiamo assistendo oggi. Quindi non c'è e il webinar è stato preparato anche tempo fa, quindi non ci sono riferimenti diretti a quanto sta succedendo. Sarebbe forse fuori luogo, anche per rispetto appunto a chi sta soffrendo in questa guerra, se trovassimo punti di contatto. Questo purtroppo è dovuto al fatto che le guerre si assomigliano un po' tutte, soprattutto per quello che i civili sopportano e subiscono. Right, having said that, our title is The Rhetoric of War, and we'll be seeing Henry V by Shakespeare, some World War I poets, and then John Donne, who comes in strangely in this topic by way of the Falklands War. So quite a few things we have on our hand. And we begin with the film, which is quite strange. We haven't done that before. We begin with the film, or with the cinema, because the cinema is the biggest form of propaganda, also war propaganda, unfortunately. Why? Simply because the cinema reaches many more people than written texts do. That's a fact. But as usual, when we talk about the cinema, behind every film or fiction, there's always, or nearly always, a written text. In our case, the text is Henry V, one of Shakespeare's history plays. And the film is the Henry V, directed by Laurence Olivier, which came out in 1944. These are two posters of the film, which came out and was immensely popular, both in England and the United States. This is what Laurence Olivier said about that. I had a mission. My country was a war. I felt Shakespeare within me. I felt the cinema within him, it's a short quote, but it tells a lot about what about Laurence Olivier in the first place, about the relationship between Shakespeare and the cinema, and about the times when the film was made. Now, in 1943, the film was commissioned to Olivier by the Ministry of War, or show business propaganda. Obviously, it wasn't the first war film to come out, either in England or the United States at that time, or any other country for that matter, any other country war. But this was something different. With the Normandy landing in 1944, not too far ahead in time, Shakespeare's Henry V seemed perfectly suited to the spirit of the nation in times of war. And they asked Laurence Olivier, to make a film of that. Now, let's stop a bit and ask ourselves a couple of questions, obvious really, but they're important. Why Laurence Olivier in the first place? Well, simply because Laurence Olivier was one of the three great Shakespearean actors of the time, the other two being John Gielgud and Ralph Richardson. But differently, unlike them, Laurence Olivier was also a Hollywood star. He was already very famous throughout the world for his roles in Wuthering Heights, for instance, or Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, the thriller. He was handsome, he was dashing, he was the perfect hero to embody the figure of Henry V. But then what about Henry V? Why the Ministry of War Propaganda picked on Henry V and not, for instance, on Hamlet, which is more famous as a play, or King Lear, or on Julius Caesar? Well, the answer is quite simple. Henry V was the most patriotic work ever written by Shakespeare. Why? Because it's the only play, only history play, but generally the only play that shows us, that tells us about the English at war on the continent, which is exactly what was happening in war times during that war. And Henry V was the most patriotic work, also because the king, the English king, was the embodiment of the chivalric hero. Already in Shakespeare's time, he was very famous. Well, he was dead by then, obviously, but it was a custom. It had become a literary and a touristic attraction to go to Westminster Abbey and to see the tombs of the English kings and queens, but especially kings at that time, and to pay a penny to see the helmet and the sword of Henry V. So it was an attraction, King Harry, who reigned for a short time, by the way, 1513 to 1522. But in the meantime, he, in 1415, he reported a great victory in France at Agincourt. So he was a great war hero, even in Shakespeare's time. And Henry V was always one of Shakespeare's most popular plays, even in his own time. And it's been so for a long, long time. This is the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt, commemorated at Westminster Abbey on 29th of October 2015, which shows that the cult of King Harry has never abated throughout the centuries. And the point is that it wasn't just one work by Shakespeare, one play by Shakespeare, but more generally, Shakespeare had become a sort of totem for every political cause and for every war cause. This has been put quite well by Jack Lynch, an American scholar. As Shakespeare became the great English genius, people increasingly used him to advance their own agendas. A choice and apt quotation could lend Shakespeare's authority to a policy, a political party, an educational program, even a war. In revolutionary ages, sorry, that's a mistake, Shakespeare became a revolutionary. In conservative ages, Shakespeare became a conservative. Whatever was needed to preserve his position as a national poet. And if he didn't quite say the right thing or say quite the right thing, his work could always be rewritten to suit the purpose. And as we know, rewriting Shakespeare has been a favorite sport with writers, stage directors, film directors throughout the ages. And rewriting Shakespeare has been very popular with politicians too. Just one example, in 1723, Aaron Hill rewrites Henry V in anti-French function because the relation between France and England at that time were pretty bad. And the title becomes not just King Henry V, but also the conquest of France by the English. Quite explicit, isn't it? And the plays change as far as is needed to convince the public of the difference between their dolphin or their king and our king, which is meant obviously to show the difference between the two countries. The French are a race of effeminate, weak people, whereas the English are warlike and strong. So Shakespeare was partly written to show that. Um, Now, the key point in Henry V was not just the story of the English going to move into the continent and conquering France, which was something good in itself, obviously. But in it, the play contains one of the most famous speeches written by Shakespeare, and that's the St. Crispin's Day speech. We will have seen it already. Act 4, Scene 3, we will have heard it already. Maybe we can easily go on YouTube or if we had the DVD, heard it pronounced by or delivered, to be more precise, by Laurence Olivier in the first place, but also by Kenneth Branagh in the 1989 remake of the film. So St. Crispin's Day speech. Why is it so famous? Why is it so apt as a speech to boost the morale in time of war? Well, because this is about the famous Battle of Agincourt. This is spoken at the eve of the battle, and the point is that the French greatly outnumbered the English. Well, they say 5-1, it might not be that much. But even so, the English are outnumbered. And at one point, while King Henry is speaking to his troops before the battle, somebody says, well, we wish there were more men here, more Englishmen here. And the king says, what's he that wishes so? No, my fair cousin, his cousin Westmoreland, if we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. It's already a loss for a country. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. Of course, this is very chivalric, very medieval. If it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. So the greater the enemy is, the greater the honor. And King Henry goes on to say, no, faith, my cousin, wish not one man, a man from England. Oh, do not wish one more. He which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, which is a beautiful sentence. How modern, by the way, by Shakespeare. And he goes on, let him depart. His passport shall be made. We don't want such men here. And then it touches on the day. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. The day is dedicated to Saint Crispin. He that shall live this day and see old age, he who shall outlive this day, will yearly, every year on the vigil feast, will feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is Saint Crispian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars. And here we can imagine the actor doing that, the actor who plays the king, and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. And it goes on and on, beautiful lines. And we come to the most famous part of this famous speech. And Crispian shall now go by the feast from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that shed his blood with me shall be my brother. Be never so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manners cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. Well, imagine this, being spoken by a very good actor like Laurence Olivier, or being delivered by Kenneth Branagh, or any actor for that matter. it's enough to set audiences on fire. It was enough, more than enough, to boost the morale of the English audiences and American audiences at that time. Um, Now, it's quite likely that the line "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers" has rung a bell, and rightly so, because that sentence or that phrase has been used time and again, especially "we few, we happy few." It was used, for instance, by Admiral Horatio Nelson at the eve of the Battle of the Nile, and then by countless leaders throughout the ages. And believe it or not, but it was also used by members of the English Parliament where after the vote leave for the Brexit. The English name, well, the names in Shakespeare, Bedford, Exeter, Warwick, Talbot, were substituted with names of prominent vote leave activists. So whether it was the battle against Napoleon, or whether it was the Brexit issue, Shakespeare came in handy. And this sentence in particular, "we few, we happy few." Now, the rhetorical war, in the case of Henry V, shows not just in such a beautiful speech or in the fact that it's about the English, going to war on the continent, but also in the way the story was adapted to contemporary needs of war propaganda. Why? Well, because, well, many of us will have thought by now, well, it's all very well, that this is a great play, a great patriotic play, but what about the French? The English at that time in World War II were not at war with the French, they were at war with the Germans. And by no stretch of the imagination can the French be turned into Germans and vice versa, at that time, especially. So, what happened? Oh, by the way, sorry, I forgot about this. It's been said that some of the famous 1904 radio speeches by Winston Churchill were inspired by the St. Crispin's Day speech. This is a poster at that time, and look at the headline: "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." This Shakespearean ring of that is quite clear. Um, and Band of Brothers might have rung another bell. The American war drama miniseries produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, with the title is taken from the St. Crispin's line we just read, and the slogan, so to speak, or the motto, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," was spoken at the end of the miniseries. This is to show to how many different uses this has been put to. But to go back to our film, uh, with British troops dying in France, Laurence Olivier, felt bound by patriotic duty to soften Shakespeare's brutal and uncompromising depiction of war, because that's what we really have in the play, in Henry V by Shakespeare. Now, so here there were two problems. The first one I already outlined. What about the French? They're not our enemies now, they're our allies. And what about the brutality of war? We don't want to show the English or the British to be too brutal. And in fact, Olivier eliminated everything that might tarnish Henry's or the English image. How? Just a few examples. The treacherous English earls are left out. In the play, some English noblemen betray. And one of them, Bardolph, for instance, is executed. Now, there's no mention of the treachery, there's no mention of the execution of an Englishman by the king. But especially look at number 3 and 4. The French city of Harfleur surrenders without Henry threatening to leave its naked infants spitted upon spikes, because that's exactly what Henry V says in the play. He threatens the town. If you do not surrender, take heed, your naked infants will be spitted upon spikes, swords, spikes, spears. Also, there is no order in the film, there is no order from Henry that every soldier killed his prisoner. And of course, these are quotations from the play. So these were left out. Everything was turned down to show that the English were not so cruel at the war. And in the end, the film by Laurence Olivier tells us much about the marriage. So it's about the marriage between the friend, England and France, which is, of course, real in the play because Henry V marries the French princess, thus uniting the two kingdoms. And the film is dedicated to the commandos and airborne troops of Great Britain, the spirit of whose ancestors it has been humbly attempted to recapture. Well, the rhetoric of war, of course, is not in Shakespeare or just for dramatic purposes, but in the way it has been put to the service of the most disparate or different causes. The main point here, leaving Shakespeare for the time being, we'll go back to it, to him in a short while, considering the general aspect of the rhetoric of war. For ages, until quite recently, in fact, to die for one's country was thought to be, dying for one country was thought to be the greatest honor possible, and conversely, the supreme duty. The idea was encapsulated in the famous Latin tag by the Roman poet Horace, Dulce decorum est pro patria mori, which will bring to mind a poem by Wilfred Owen, obviously, to many of us, if not all of us. Before we do that, let's see another very famous rendering of the Dulce decorum est pro patria mori theme by a soldier and a fine poet, Rupert Brooke, who died during the war. He's very famous, as his poem is, so we won't deal with that at length, except to notice a few things. Here we have a positive approach to the war, apparently, and Rupert Brooke, the soldier, and the title is significant. It's a sort of everyman, every soldier, no name, might be easily identified with the writer, who in fact died shortly after writing this poem. But the one thing which is striking for us in this context is the insistence, not so much of war, because the cruelty of war is outside the poem altogether, apart from the title, The Soldier, and apart from the very first sentence, if I should die. After that, it all goes back to England, sweet old England. In fact, England and English are repeated many times throughout the poem. How many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 times in 14 lines. And the England, which is depicted here, is a sort of ideal country. The air is balmy. The sons of home bless the country. It's a land of happy dreams. It's a land of laughter. It's a land of gentleness, of peace. English heaven is the very last words, which is of course an ideal picture of England. England was quite different, like any other country, by the way. But anyway, that's one of the best known expressions of the glory to die for one's country. And as we anticipated, that was badly questioned in Wilfred Owen's famous poem, Dulce decorum, about which, it's very famous, so we won't go into details, but a few things are worth noticing. Owen died in the war too, just a few days before the armistice was signed. It's bitter irony. And I want to see with you the contrast between the title Dulce Decorum. Now, today, Dulce Decorum might not tell much to many people, maybe, but at that time, anyone who read poetry knew what it was about, knew what followed, Dulce Decorum pro patria mori, because the reading public was up to that. And what does the poem give us after that very promising title, with its time-honored rings of chivalry and battles fought for one's country, chivalric soldiers, great knights, not triumphing armies, quite the contrary. We see broken down soldiers. They're not even soldiers, they're bent double. They look like old beggars. They knock-kneed, they cough like hags. They can hardly walk. They trudge. They do not march in triumph. If they do march, they trudge. But if they do march, is in line 5, they march asleep without boots. And their feet are covered not with boots, but with blood. They're lame, they're blind, they're deaf. So the main senses have been abandoned: lame, blind, deaf. And they're deaf even to the hoots of gas shells. Gas is obviously the object of the second part of the poem, which is not only something horrible, but it's something totally out of place in the contents evoked by the title. The title, Dulce Decorum est pro patria mori, evokes fair, if we can say that, fair battles, if there ever were fair battles. But anyway, fighting in a chivalric way. Whereas gas, quick boys, that's the worst way of fighting a war. Something which really kills people from afar, and the death following is really horrible, as we can see here. Floundering like a man in fire, or lime, quick fire. And it all comes back in a dream to the poet. He plunges at me, the dying soldier, guttering, choking, drowning. And here we come to the famous conclusion, about which, which third part I want to see with you just a couple of things. The beginning of 2 consecutive clauses. If the repetition here, the anaphora, highlights the insistence, if you could hear, if you too could taste. Now he invokes the aid of the reader, the participation, in fact, of the reader, their sympathy. If you could face that, if you could feel like I felt, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, Dulce Decorum est pro patria mori. The old lie, it couldn't be simpler, it couldn't be more effective. It's a lie, simply. The fact that it's old, that it's a time-honored tag, doesn't make it a lie the less, not in the least. And I want to point to your attention the telling rhyme between glory and mori. So glory and mori rhyme, but the meaning of that has been reversed. It's not a glorious death, like in ancient times. It's an old lie. It's a horrible death, like a devil sick of sin, in the 4th line from the top. The same thing which is told in the poem is shown in this beautiful and terrible painting by the American painter John Singer Sargent, 1918 again, which is called Ghast. So this is really about the poem. It's an illustration of the poem. That's one of the reasons why we put in our anthologies, time and again because it's so telling. We see the dead soldier, we see the men marching or trudging, better, and they have ribbons on their faces, on their eyes, because they're blind. They've been blinded. And the even more terrible thing is that this is a picture which might seem an illustration of the point, but of course we know that both Sargent and Owen knew about the war, so they were not inventing things, unfortunately, as is shown by this photograph, which is exactly the same scene we see in the painting and the same scene which is described in the poem. And again, we wanted time after time to put that in as well, because there's nothing more telling than this. They have one hand on the next man's shoulder simply because they're blind, or they've been blinded or near blind, and they do not know where to go. So only the first man leads. It's a shocking and terrible image. And that is why the glory of women or glory of the war was toned down and deflated, in fact, in so many poems of the time. This is another very famous one, we're all familiar with that, by Sigrid Sassoon, came out in 1916. And it's about the women who are at home. I don't think this is really hard on the women. It's hard on the war propaganda. Why? Because the women at home have to believe the war propaganda, which says that they're heroes, all of them, which says that they are only wounded in mentionable places, whereas, as we know, many people were wounded in their genitals, for instance, but that's never said, not by the press. You believe that chivalry redeems the war's disgrace. Chivalry and war's disgrace are put side by side, and with purpose. You listen with delight by tales of dirt and danger fondly thrilled. You crown our distant ardors while we fight, and mourn our laureled memories when we're killed. You can't believe that British troops retire. Why? Because simply that's not told by the press, by the war propaganda. British troops never retire. Mind you, any other troops in the world. I mean, the war propaganda is the same all over the world, has been the same all over the world. And again, blind with blood, the terrible corpses and the troops. And then he ends on a very sad note, and not full of sympathy for the German mother, dreaming by the fire, while you're knitting socks to send your son, his face is trodden deeper in the mud. So I don't believe this is meant to highlight women's idealism or blindness to what was happening. It's simply that they were exposed to a war propaganda that did not say things they were. And when we talk about war propaganda, we should never forget the posters, which were very telling, very explicit. This is the famous one. Women of Britain say go. Other posters were even more explicit, by showing a man in his armchair with his wife looking at him sadly, if not pathetically, and his son telling him, "Father, why didn't you go to war?" So everything was meant to show that every man had to go to war. And let's not forget, that World War I was presented as the war to end all wars. Unfortunately, that was not true. And a war which should have lasted only a few months lasted 4 years. And it's a known fact that in the middle of the war, already in 1916, peace was offered for some reason, for a number of reasons. war was continued, was not stopped. And that meant millions of men dying more, million dying more. The estimate is up to 10 million men lost their life, losing their lives on the battlefield, and another 20 million badly wounded. To make things worse, the peace that followed, the famous or notorious Versailles Peace Treaty, didn't solve things. And in 20 years' time, we would have another war. Also because of posters like this. By the way, we have a very similar one in Italian too. Of course, Italy was allied with England and France during that war. And this is a kind of poster that did not facilitate things after the war, depicting Germans as beasts, really. We see on the upper left corner a German soldier, thrusting his bayonet through a naked infant, as in Shakespeare Henry V, by the way, remember? Then another one torturing a war prisoner, and a third one on the right side, having just probably raped a woman, an English woman. So the same German who did that must not return as a sailing agent, traveling salesman after the war. Now, by that time, the war to end all wars was not convincing anyone. That slogan was not convincing. And a new idea of war had set in, the idea that there were no just wars. And I believe that shows very well in a sentence, famous sentence by Virginia Woolf, written in her essay, 3 Guineas. Let's look at the date, 1938, which is at the eve of World War II. The war was looming up, already seemed inevitable for the many mistakes done before, including those we have just highlighted. And while everyone was preparing for the war, while everyone, while the official propaganda was already saying that we are going to have another war and every man and woman must do their part, Virginia Woolf writes, as a woman, I have no country. Because the appeal, obviously, the rallying cry was, so you must serve your country. And Virginia Woolf says, as a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world. And we know very well how much Virginia Woolf loved her country, but she couldn't see her country to be hypocritically used as an excuse for going to war, even a war like World War II. And now we go back to Shakespeare for a while, very short while, because as many of us know, Henry V was filmed again in 1988 by Kenneth Branagh, the most famous Shakespearean actor and director today, I believe. And already the posters here tell us that the tide has changed in a way. The way Henry V was presented was quite different from the way Laurence Olivier had presented it some 45 years before. It shows also from the posters, which are less chivalric in images. In their images, we see dead corpses, we see fire, the fire and destruction of war. Apart from the writing on the right-hand poster. Why is that? Well, because at that time, reading Henry V as an invitation to war at all costs was not really possible, or at least, many people, most people, did not believe in that any longer, let alone Kenneth Branagh. This is what Daniel Rosenthal writes about Branagh's film, which is bold, and he highlights Branagh's bold, moving concentration on the human cost of war rather than heroism, because that's what the film highlights. The gritty realism, gritty, not triumphant, was designed to reflect British ambivalence to military expeditions. Why? Because that came 7 years after the controversial Falklands conflict. And though Oliver's film was made in wartime, it is Branagh who more clearly reveals how Shakespeare play laid down a template and model for countless war movies about 20th century conflict. And so, for instance, the execution of Bardolph, the treacherous English earl, is depicted there. And um, the cruelty, the brutality of war is present in Branagh's film. But that was after World War II. That was after the Korean War. That was after Vietnam. That was after many, many wars all around the world, the sort of never-ending war. And that was after the Falklands conflict, which was the last one to be fought by Britain in 1982. And now, one of the things about the Falkland conflict was that to many people it seemed to be the readiness with which England or Britain entered, or the UK entered the conflict, made war against Argentina. To many people seemed Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's way of getting around the sudden loss of popularity she was experiencing. Elections were ahead, and it was quite possible that she would not be elected. So to many people, she chose the war. She entered the war very quickly in order to raise her popularity, making appeal to the country's patriotism, as it many times happened. And the official position is shown in this editorial or leading article in the Time, which came out at the very time of war, April 1982. The article was titled "We Are Lord Falklanders Now," and the Times is clearly in favor of armed British intervention. The highly patriotic tone of the whole passage is quite clear. And it seems a bit strange when at a time when patriotic ideas seem to be a thing of the past. We must remember that the Falklands War came after the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, which were times in which the appeal was to universal peace, freedom, justice, make love, not war, the battle cry of the hippies, the young generation in the 1960s and 70s. The editorial is quite interesting. If we look at the way it presents the situation, a very clever way, by the way. It's a great piece of rhetoric, great piece of journalism, whatever we think of that. And it falls in nicely with the whole thing, the whole problem of propaganda, war propaganda. So it starts with the fact the Falkland Islands are British territory inhabited by British citizens. They have been invaded by enemy forces, and that's a fact that couldn't be avoided. Then there's the appeal to patriotic unity. The Falklanders are our people; they are British citizens. The Falkland Islands are British territory, etc., etc., etc. An invasion of our spirit. We are all Falklanders now. But the interesting thing for us comes in the last part of the article, the conclusion of the article. We are an island race. At this point of decision, the words of John Donne could not be more appropriate for every Briton, for every islander, for every man and woman anywhere in a world menaced by the forces of tyranny. So, very rhetorically, there's a climax or gradatio here. Every Briton, every islander, every man and woman anywhere in the world. No man, and the words quoted from John Donne are, "No man is an island in tide of itself." Very famous words. "Any man's death diminishes me, because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee, it tolls for us, it tolls for them." Well, these words are very famous. The point is that they are, I would say, misquoted, in the sense that John Donne's words in his sermon, or meditation as it was called, um, are not for war, but rather for universal peace. That's the meaning of "any man's death diminishes me." He says quite clearly that if a man dies, it's a piece, even though a small one, of the continent that goes with him. And he mentioned the continent, by the way, and Europe, not England, which is quite telling. So this has been turned upside. Whatever we think of the Falkland Wars, I'm not taking sides here. It's not important. The important thing is to show how how poets and prose writers can be appropriated to war propaganda every time, for every war, in every age, in every country. Because, of course, the most famous use of the phrase "for whom the bell tolls" is by Ernest Hemingway, who chose it as title of his novel about the civil war in Spain. And again, that's a different use, quite a different use, not a political one for that. We are approaching, with the Falklands War, we are approaching our time. And unfortunately, as we said, wars have been going on. They keep going on all the time. They haven't been stopped. And I end with something which is really quite strong, and I hope not too strong. This is a picture of a photo of an Iraqi soldier burned in the Gulf War, which took place a few years after the Falklands conflict, from August 1990 to January 1991. It was a fairly short war. The photograph, by the way, is the Iraqi man burned alive, is by Kenneth Jarecki. Jarecki, Jareecke, a photograph, because he thought that he would stop the war. He was in favor of negotiations instead of war, and he hoped that this terrible picture, might convince people in the United States, but also throughout the world. As it happened, nobody wanted the picture. The major media, would not run the picture. One of the person who took that up was the English poet Tony Harrison. It's a very strong and very beautiful poem he wrote about that, called "Coming." And let's not be surprised if it came out in The Guardian, because Tony Harrison is a poet, he's still alive, fortunately, is a poet who used to go to wars. He went to Yugoslavia, for instance, during the war, to former Yugoslavia during the war, and he went to Iraq, and he wanted his poems to be published, not just in books of poetry, which they would eventually, obviously, but also in newspapers. He was a war correspondent, and he wrote poems about what he saw. And this is about the Chad Iraqi soldier. And he imagines here to interview the Iraqi soldier, ready to write down thoughts for men. And I saw the Chad Iraqi lean like someone made of plasticine, as though he'd stopped to ask the way. And this is what I heard him say. The nursery rhyme rhythm of the poem is, of course, meant to highlight the atrocity of the war. Don't be afraid I've picked on you for this exclusive interview, says the dead Iraqi soldier. Isn't it your sort of poet's task to find words for this frightening mask? So I held, um, says Tony Harrison, the shaking microphone closer to the crumbling bone. So press record. I want to reach the warring nations with my speech. And the speech says that no war is a just war. Lie, he asks Tony Harrison, and pretend that I excuse my being bombed by American and allies bombed. Lie and pretend I pardon and forgive that they still do. And then maybe, and here comes the counterpart, the other side of the question, I'm spared confessing that only fire burnt out the shame of things I'd done in Saddam's name, the terrible things I'd done in Saddam's name, the deaths, the torture, and the plunder, the black clouds all of us are under. Say that I'm smiling, excuse the scuds we, the Iraqi, launch against the Jews. Pretend I've got the imagination to see the world beyond one nation. That's your job, poet. To pretend I want my foe to be my friend, which is quite strong, quite sad. It's about a dead man, in fact, who's totally disillusioned with war, who sees that war means killing on both sides. And of course, the worst thing about war is that the civilians are killed hundreds of times more than soldiers. And that, I'm afraid, is what is peculiar to modern warfare. Up to the 19th century, most of the victims of war were soldiers, which is not to say that it was right to kill people during wars. It was right having wars, obviously. But increasingly during the 20th century, civilians began to outnumber the number of soldiers killed. And this is a poem going back to World War One, and I'd like to close with this one by Sigrid Sassoon again, which we include in our last anthology, Base Details, 1919. If I were fierce and bold and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base. If I were fierce and bold, which means a bit old too, and short of breath again old, I'd live at the base, not on the front, with majors, and speed glam heroes up to the line of death. So I'm at the base, beyond the lines, and I would speed heroes, glamorous heroes, up to the line of death. You'd see me with my puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel. So drinking and eating a lot in the best hotel. And then reading the Roll of Honor, the list of men who have died. Poor young chap, I'd say, I used to know his father well. Yes, we've lost heavily in this last crap. So he just, makes a few casual remarks about the poor young chap again, because only the young die in war. I used to know young soldiers. I used to know his father well. And when the war is done and youth's stone dead, I toddle safely home and die in bed. Base details, because these are details about what happens at the base, where generals and majors are. And they are base because Sassoon is ashamed of them. Why? Because they send young people to die, and they died by the millions. And while they toddle safely home and die in bed. And there's a touching novel by the Canadian writer Harrison, which is titled Generals Die in Bed, which I believe says most about the war, the atrocity of war. And I would stop here. And unfortunately, the subject of our talk does not stop here and will not stop for who knows how long. So thank you for your attention.
Grazie mille, professor Cattaneo, è una tematica che, insomma, sono arrivati molti complimenti, molti commenti e anche scambi di materiali tra i vari docenti, perché è una tematica che molti stanno svolgendo adesso in classe o hanno appena svolto, quindi è stato interessante leggere gli scambi. E purtroppo, vabbè, collegato a questa triste attualità, abbiamo detto prima che avevamo già preparato il webinar
Molto
tempo fa.
prima, sì.
Ecco. Lei è partito da Shakespeare, quindi parto con una domanda collegata a lui. Quindi in che modo Shakespeare parla della guerra in altre sue opere?
Beh, Shakespeare parla della guerra. Allora, se per guerra intendiamo un conflitto armato, parla della guerra in diverse opere. Beh, i drammi storici sono più o meno tutti su un conflitto armato, cioè su uno scontro fra varie armate. Come dicevamo prima, la grossa differenza rispetto a Henry V, Enrico V, è che quello è l'unica opera sostanzialmente in cui si parli di un contingente dell'esercito inglese che fa guerra sul continente, fa guerra, cioè non sono guerre interne, per intenderci. Shakespeare parla di guerra ovviamente anche nei drammi romani. Giulio Cesare, c'è la guerra civile romana, nell'Antonio e Cleopatra abbiamo la guerra tra l'Oriente e Occidente, se vogliamo, per come è posta, quindi tra Antonio, Cleopatra, Ottaviano. Sostanzialmente questo. C'è anche un dramma meno conosciuto, interessante, che è Troilus and Cressida, che è sulla guerra di Troia, però che è vista dal punto di vista di personaggi minori. Vengono menzionati anche alcuni dei maggiori, Achille, Diomede, Ettore, però sostanzialmente è una storia di un amore contrastato appunto sui campi opposti. La cosa interessante lì, se qualcuno volesse farci una ricerca, anche se non è facile per i nostri ragazzi, i nostri studenti, è che è una deflation, proprio vengono deflated, vengono abbassati le pretese della guerra. Cioè è la guerra di Troia che per antonomasia la grande guerra del mondo classico, viene vista invece nei suoi aspetti più sordidi anche. E questo la dice lunga forse anche sul modo in cui Shakespeare vedeva la guerra, senza voler mettere in bocca a Shakespeare o in testa a Shakespeare cose che noi pensiamo. Ecco, di sicuro la nostra lettura di quel play potrebbe essere interessante, proprio perché è una lettura poco eroica della guerra.
Benissimo. Un'altra domanda molto interessante. Ci sono testi che parlano della guerra, ma dalla parte dei civili più che dalla parte dei soldati?
Dunque sì, ce ne son tanti. Come sempre noi cerchiamo di ragionare su testi che possano essere proposti più o meno facilmente in classe ai nostri studenti. Uno famoso, che c'è in diverse compilation, in diverse antologie, è la breve poesia di Thomas Hardy, In the Time of the Breaking of Nations, per esempio, che agli inizi del Novecento e durante la prima guerra mondiale per certi aspetti, però è visto completamente, molto breve, dalla parte della campagna inglese, cioè letteralmente siamo nella campagna inglese, quella che è cara a Thomas Hardy, e abbiamo un contadino che ara il suo campo, il fumo che sale, se ricordo bene, dai solchi scavati nella terra, aperti nella terra, e soprattutto una coppia di giovani innamorati che vanno per la campagna. E il poeta conclude dicendo appunto che la loro storia vivrà quando gli annali della guerra saranno dimenticati. È una visione anche che forse appunto potrebbe essere utilmente riproposta oggi, di grande speranza, non la speranza di superficie, Hardy non è mai superficiale, che alla fine la vita trionfa sulla morte, quella morte che è la guerra, per forza di cose. Un altro testo che noi abbiamo inserito proprio nell'ultima edizione, lo cito perché è lì, non per altro, insomma, perché non non è così facile da trovare. È un racconto di Hemingway sul suo periodo a Milano durante una convalescenza per una ferita. Ed è un racconto in Times of War, la collezione Il racconto, in cui parla della sua esperienza. Ed è interessante perché non solo descrive alcune cose come andare al caffè Cova a Milano, e i milanesi lo conosceranno, in centro, ma a parte quello con altri soldati feriti durante la guerra, altri ufficiali, perché devono passare per un quartiere centrale, che allora però era un quartiere molto popolare, e vengono insultati dai reduci di guerra, sono feriti, perché c'era anche una fortissima reazione contro la guerra in tutti i paesi, che veniva cancellata dalla propaganda, cioè soldati che tornavano e descrivevano la realtà della guerra, tutt'altro che cavalleresca o patriottica come veniva dipinta sui mezzi di comunicazione. E quindi insomma Hemingway riporta il disagio, anche un po' quasi la paura, insomma, di passare per questo quartiere centrale allora, ma molto popolare, di Milano, in cui sia lui che gli ufficiali reduci di guerra italiani venivano insultati da pacifisti o comunque da reduci di guerra anche, che erano stati feriti. Quindi da un altro aspetto della guerra dal punto di vista dei civili. Cito questi due perché sono abbastanza vicini.
Benissimo. Allora, purtroppo siamo giunti al termine di questo evento, quindi intanto ringrazio molto il professor Cattaneo, ringrazio tutti i partecipanti che ci hanno seguito e vi auguro intanto una buona serata e a presto.
Grazie, un saluto a tutti. Arrivederci.